These repressions were talked to in the past. They are and were the subject of many books, many films that have been done, let's say, since the end of the 80s. And you can find all kind of memories, all kind of archives being published, although we all know that the Fond Democratia is going to be closed, so it's a big problem. But I mean, if you want to know what happened in Stalin's time or in Soviet time, you have every opportunity and every means to do so in Russia, which wasn't the case, let's say, in Soviet time. Of course, you also have a lot of literature about the purges, about Stalin, where you have all kind of very dubious information. Let's say that you have the choice, and if you want to know, there is no reason why you shouldn't be ignorant. However, we also see that in present-day Russia, Stalin is increasingly being presented as a positive and wise leader, and purges are often justified. That was what was said this morning. It's just like, since they won the war, or since they brought like such a big contribution to the victory, it sort of erases the problem that the purges represented. It's sort of worth it. It was sort of worth it, and it's presented that way in school books. Yes, there were purges, but because of purges, we could win the war. And furthermore, there is another problem, that many Russian people still know very little of the history in their own family and about the fate of close relatives who are not mentioned even within the family circle. So they cannot know the history of the country, because when you ask them, and your grandfather, what happened to him, a lot of people still don't know exactly what happened. Nevertheless, we can observe that there is some kind of a new generation, of part of a new generation, some 30-something post-Soviet intellectual, not just in Russia, also, for example, in Belarus, including writers Sergei Lebedev, in Belarus, Sasha Filipenko, or in a different way, the philosopher Denis Karagodin, we were talking about this morning, who identified the person having executed his grandfather in 1937. Well, these young people have tackled head-on the issues of Soviet repression, of the lack of memory in Russian, Belarusian society, and of the consequences of these forgotten and unsaid facts. In that way, they joined those who undertook this work in previous decades, like the Memorial Association, who appeared in the late 80s, and even before, like Alexander Solzhenitsyn and other dissidents who tried to publish documents. They show that way that the question of Stalinism is not settled yet, and that it divides post-Soviet societies, maybe even more than ever. But they also show that there's a need among younger generation to come to terms with this past. Maybe as there was such a need in Germany in the 60s. And that way, I think that we can have some kind of a comparison. And here I'm going to talk about a very small theater group, the KNAM Theater, which is working very far from Moscow, and that recently staged 2 plays that talk about trauma, memory, post-memory, without using these words, without having maybe the theoretical context, and they evoke personal commitment as a condition for individuals to assert their right to exist, a right that was too often denied in Soviet Russia and maybe even in Russia now. The KNAM Theater is a small theater in Komsomolsk na Amurie, Komsomolsk on Amur, which is like 9 hours by plane from Moscow to Khabarovsk, and then 6 or 7 hours by train or bus. In that region, you had very many camps in Stalin times, and the town was built not by Komsomolsk, as they say, and as Dmitry Medvedev said a couple of years ago. It was built mainly by prisoners of these camps. This is one of the original lies, or myth if you want. The KNAM theater was created at the very beginning of perestroika. It is a child of freedom, says one of the actors, which means that the people who started it, they were basically 20 during perestroika. Now it's the generation of 50 years old. It has only 5 permanent staff members, including stage director, 56-year-old Tatiana Folova, and you can't have more than 30 people in the theater itself. But the KNAM regularly presents its creation in France. It will be in Amsterdam at the beginning of September. For those people who will be here, go and see it, it's worth it. Because it's not, this theater is not invited to play in big Russian towns. You cannot see them play in Moscow, you cannot see them play in St. Petersburg. 2 of their last plays, I Am, Ja jest, ja существую, and I have not started living yet, я еще не начинал жить, were played in France and Belgium in the past 5 years, and they address directly the question of Soviet repressions and of their current consequences. And what is interesting, and which is in the mood of the documentary theater that is very much active now, for example, also in Moscow, they rely on testimonials and historical documents. It's not like a written play. They use testimonials of people who went through this. There is no intrigue. There are a succession of various scenes. The actors do not play roles. They are supposed to be themselves and to talk about themselves in the first person singular. And also, they're all like very beautiful, but it's not like what I'm gonna talk about. An important part of the first play, I Am, consists of the monologues told by the 3 actors in the first person singular about the story of their own families, usually starting with the grandparents. Their stories are filled with what we know: arrest, detentions, executions, deportations, famines, and forced emigration. Memories of other victims complete these testimonials. These monologues that brings like the history closer to people watching it. They also include a jailed grandmother who, I quote, remained a convinced Stalinist till her death. A grandfather who was scared all his life of being arrested and died young. A father who, I quote, was killed by fear and started drinking. And his son, the actor who is on the scene, says that he believes that the fate of his family is typical of the fate of many families in the USSR. War, repression, lack of faith, destroyed lives, not materialized dreams, and as a result, alcohol. The second play, I've not started living yet, has a different approach. It tells in a chronological and almost didactic way, from Lenin to Putin, the story of a century of repression. The testimony of the troop members, what did my father do, what did my grandfather do, are completed by those of Komsomolsk's residents and by letters, by Cheka reports, literary works, and official speeches. And at several times, Folova writes on a blackboard the number of victims of repressions at the period that were just mentioned. Furthermore, this second play explores much more than I Am, and on the basis of very concrete examples, the problems of everyday life in the USSR, but also in today's Russia, starting with poverty and a constant lack of respect for the individual. The problems of close relatives who were broken during Brezhnev's stagnations are told. Such were the fates of Folova's father and of an actor's father, who also became violent when he drank. His son says, according to psychologists, aggression comes from fear. Why did he suffer so much? Where did his fear come from? I can only guess. He was born in the Gulag. His mother, my grandmother, had been repressed. He could not adapt to this life and committed suicide. And it turns out that the repression's consequences did not stop with the repressions themselves. And almost no one talks about it in Russia. Thus, in both places, the KNAM establishes a link between repressions, the material difficulties in everyday life, in Soviet time and nowadays, and the intimate sufferings of individuals 1, 2, or 3 generations later. And Alexander, for example, who disappeared, talked about it this morning, like this post-memory stuff. An explanation is put forward. The purges have not been sufficiently talked about. They were not condemned. Like it was said, no one was judged. No one had to respond of the fact that they had killed some people. Their perpetrators were never punished. And in the second play, I have not started living yet, a reflection begins on the lack of individual sanction. I quote, "What do we do with those who committed these crimes? We should punish all the informers. So what? It's impossible to imprison millions of people. In our country, 1 in 10 people wrote a denunciation." And Tatiana Frolova, who is on the scene, concludes, 1955 was our first mistake. We missed the boat. We did the first step, but we were afraid to do the second one. We did not have our Nuremberg process. Since then, pages of history have been forgotten, which is symbolized by another narrative thread in the play. The mother of the main actress is suffering from Alzheimer's disease, and she's losing her memory. This implicit comparison is also present, for example, in Filippenko's novel Red Cross. If both plays evoke the consequences that the repressions and the silences around them, we were talking this morning about silences, have had on today's Russian people, I Have Not Started Living Yet starts explicitly with a monologue in which Frolova expresses, in the first person singular, her motivation for staging this play. She said she's seen as optimistic and smiling, but that she is actually scared of everything since childhood. This fear, which she explained by the repressions of the past, marks her and her compatriots even physically. And she started looking for the cause of this fear. From there is only one step to begin a reflection on the instrumentalization of the past by the authorities in Soviet times and now. However, if the condemnation of Soviet repressions is implicable, I Have Not Started Living Yet also implies that the memory problem, and therefore the identity problem, who am I, existed before the Soviet period. Could it be not only a consequence of the repressions, but also one of their causes? The answer is not given. It's just like asked. It turns out that the Soviet repressions helped to create not only a Soviet person whose construction was claimed by the party from the start, but also a post-Soviet person. This topic is only suggested in I Am, but it is at the heart of I Have Not Started Living Yet. For example, a scene called Selection of a New Person is based on famous letters in which writer Mikhail Sholokhov described to Stalin the torture used to extort their wheat from the peasants. Then Frolova tells a similar story that her mother, who used to work in a kolkhoz, told her. One of the actors concludes, and that's how was born the new Soviet person, who, according to the architects of the communist future, was supposed to stay quietly at home, drink tea, and support the power in everything. This Soviet person was later replaced by a post-Soviet person. And the wonderful and very important to my mind writer Vladimir Sorokin wrote in August 2015 that the post-Soviet person disappointed him even more than the Soviet person. I quote him, "Now we understand that such mutations occurred in the 20th century, along with mass terror, that in fact the genetic victim of this appalling selection, the post-Soviet person, not only does not want to extract from himself that Soviet pus, but on the contrary take this pus for fresh blood. But with such blood, he becomes a zombie." The young actress in I'm Not Starting, she's 20, in the second play, evokes a post-Soviet person quite similar to the one mentioned by Sorokin. A person who comes from the time of violence and who has gotten used to violence. A person without values. But she is herself another version of this post-Soviet person. And she said that as a child, although she's 20 years old, she grew up in the 90s, she was mainly taught how to hate. She and the other actor, who is also 20-something, say that in the 90s many went mad while the level of aggression exploded. Some people had fought for our freedom and for yours, but in fact the majority did not need it. They just needed to stuff themselves or buy furniture. And what is interesting, and I'll be sort of concluding on it, is that in the two plays, there is like one way out, two ways out that are showed. The first way out is we have to tell about what happened in our family, what happened in our country. We have to say that people were killed for nothing and that some, maybe of our ancestors, took a participation in these killings. But also, they say that the big demonstrations that happened in Russia, especially in 2011 and 2012, when Putin was trying to get re-elected for another time, that these manifestations, they were also some kind of a positive affirmation of the people saying, we do exist. We cannot accept that there will be manipulation, that there will be fraud again. We do have the right to express what we think. We do have a right to have an opinion. And that is why the first play is called I Am, Ya Есть. Because if the vindication is for the right to exist and not be killed, and to express an opinion. This I is used in the testimonies, of course, but it is the I in the titles, I am, I have not started to live. The I of individuals who assert their rights in front of the states. And they proclaim in that way that their adhesion to a scale of values in which the individual is central and not the state and or a theoretical collective, as it was the case in the Soviet time. And one of the actors at one moment says, why do we stay in this town far away from everything? Partly because of memory, partly because of our history. Maybe we're staying to learn how to speak and affirm our right to be for all of ancestors who remain silent. And I will just conclude in saying that this is what is at stake, in my opinion, in Russia at the moment. This perception that the purges, you can't forget about the purges because they have consequences in people. And that now some people would like to have, nakoniec, at least the right to express themselves and to have an influence on their destiny. Thank you.